So let me welcome today's speaker, Tom Beeks. I think some of you might already know Tom or heard him speak, but if you haven't, he's a trainer at the Bell Foundation. He's worked in English language education since 2003. He's taught around the world and is particularly interested in international education and teacher development. Tom also helped create the Bell Foundation's Language for Results International suite of online training that we offer. And he also works as an assessor on our EAL-free accreditation program. And in today's webinar, which continues last week's webinar's theme of exploring how the Bell Foundation's updated classroom guidance and strategies document can be used in an international school context, Tom will explore characteristics of effective teacher learning and apply these principles to developing a CPD program on EAL in an international school context. Feel free to use the chat or the Q&A option to send any questions during the webinar as they come to you. And then if we have time at the end, I will pose the questions to Tom. In the next couple of days, you will receive an email from us with a link to the recording of the webinar and also links to any resources that Tom will be mentioning today. So thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you, Tom.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone joining us. Thank you for joining us. I know it's a very busy time of year for many of us in working in schools at the moment. And yeah, so as Sharka mentioned, our focus today is really looking at how we can develop and improve CPD on EAL, with a bit of a reference to our newly updated support strategies and how we might bring those into that equation as well. So this is the map of what we're going to do today. And we'll start by quickly looking at why CPD on EAL is important. Although I suspect if you're joining us for this webinar, you probably don't need much convincing. But I think it's useful to start with this quote from Angela Crease and Constant Leung. And I think it encapsulates why there is a need for impactful CPD on EAL. I'll let you read that quote. So in most of the international school settings that I come into contact with, there's often a real willingness to implement inclusive practices for plurilingual students. And I think there's increasingly an understanding that that's a basic requirement for schools where the majority or certainly a very large number of learners may be using English as an additional language. But as we know, it's one thing wanting to do something, or even having a policy or mission statements around inclusive practice, and it's another thing actually implementing that in the classroom. So no matter how good the intentions are, if there is a gap between inclusive ideals and teaching staff's ability to implement those, then not only can they be less effective, but they can be actively damaging to the very students that we want to help and include and support. So it's something that needs to be really carefully thought about, and it can make a gigantic impact. So we're going to explore then how we might ensure that this appropriate teacher expertise and knowledge can be developed, and how our support strategies might be used for that purpose as well. So let's start by thinking about what the evidence tells us effective CPD or teacher development looks like in the context of improving EAL provision. And I wanted to start by sort of hearing from you first. So just a very quick question. What types of CPD activity have you taken part in yourself or led, perhaps, if you are if that's part of your role at your school, if you are a leader or a trainer? I just want to see what kinds of things people do in their context or have experienced themselves during their careers. Interesting. Kieran says, we did one on AI. That's interesting phrasing. We did one. What is the one you're referring to here? Cutting a carousel, okay, of different strategies. One session, okay. Thanks. Clarifying. Yeah, not even an hour. Yeah. Often there's not a lot of time for these things. Okay, so we have, again, someone's written general literary skills. That's a topic. So I'm talking about what was it? What was it? Was it a webinar? Was it a session? Was it a face-to-face discussion? Okay. Sharp, having some ideas. So we can see that quite often CPD is linked to sessions, isn't it? And sort of face-to-face meetings or perhaps online meetings as well. I'm interested to know then which types of CPD in your experience you found most useful, and maybe why. It's a bit more of a complicated question. Maria, thank you. Co-planning and co-teaching. Okay, that's there are two other types of activity definitely that are definitely potentially very useful. You are lab sites. Okay, seeing it in action. Okay. Face-to-face with input from experienced practitioners. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of the most useful face-to-face. I think we all experienced so much online stuff, didn't we? We all have in the last few years for obvious reasons. Certainly something we hear from a lot is, yeah, face-to-face is often preferred, isn't it? Okay, and ones that promoted talk. Kieran, okay, we're trying to implement learning walks at the moment. Excellent. All right, so well, thank you for sharing your ideas. And I think we've just heard some really great examples of effective CPD and perhaps some examples of things that weren't so effective. So, you know, like really short kind of sessions that perhaps didn't really explore anything in enough depth to influence what we do. So I wanted to expend a little bit more time in this section to unpack what characterizes effective CPD and how we might want to apply that ourselves. So this section is a little bit theoretical, but I think it's going to be really important to understand these key principles, and then we can look at applying them to more practical scenarios later. And that's also useful because it allows us then to take those principles and kind of apply them in whatever our context is, because international schools are vastly different, and you know, it's not a one size fits all approach or solution that's going to be the same for everyone. And I wanted to start by introducing the Inspire model for effective teacher CPD. And this was devised, full disclosure, this was devised by my colleague at the Bell Foundation, Silvana Richardson. Some of you may know Silvana. She's a specialist in teacher development in English language education. And she has a wealth of knowledge in this area, and has been certainly a source of great inspiration for myself over the years. And as you can see, this is an acronym. The I stands for impactful. If you want to guess the others, you can, but in the interest of speed, I think we'll move along. So we have impactful, needs-based, supported, practical, insightful, reflective, and evaluated. And I'll briefly look at each characteristic in a bit more detail, and then we'll look at applying them directly to EAL specific CPD. So the first principle is that CPD should be impactful, and perhaps this is the most critical feature, of course, because if it doesn't have an impact. If it doesn't make some kind of change, then what's the point, I suppose. And I think this also speaks to whether the CPD activity is transferable. So transferable CPD causes a change in teacher expertise, leading to improved teaching, and most importantly of all, leading to changes and improved learning with the students. And that could be an improvement to learners' knowledge, skills, attitudes, or values. And it's something that seems really obvious, but it can be quite easy to lose sight of when we're working with teachers. That ultimately it's the students that we need to bear in mind. They're the ultimate recipients, really, of the professional development that we're doing. So, just to explore this a little bit more, this idea of transferability then is the move from knowing something or knowing about something to being able to do it and knowing when to do it and when it is needed. So it's really about deepening expertise. And I thought this is quite a useful way of thinking about this, according to Weston and Clay from their book, Unleashing Great Teaching. And they talk about the development of expertise happening at different levels of depth. And it starts with awareness. And this might look like reading or hearing about a new teaching strategy or tool or resource, but it's not sufficient for transferability because it's just that, okay, I know what that is, but that's about as far as it goes. The next step would be procedural knowledge. So it's knowing how to do something, that being able to follow a procedure, but without really varying it or adapting it. You're kind of just following step by step, which is when we start teaching is what we're doing all the time, right? We tend to just put in place, we're just doing what's written down in our plan very carefully, step by step. And perhaps this is something that might look like rehearsing or practicing an idea that you've read about or been told about, and it could involve maybe receiving feedback from a mentor or a colleague. Again, it's especially common in sort of initial training programs and things like that. That leads to deliberative expertise, and that's the ability to apply these procedures and strategies efficiently and effectively, and knowing basically when to use something and when it may not be so useful or it needs to be changed. And we might still need a little bit of support with some areas from a more expert practitioner, but generally speaking, we can do that on our own. And lastly, this leads to adaptive expertise, and that's the ability to implement expertly, automatically, and fluently the kind of strategy or tool that we're talking about. So it's knowing exactly when to use something, how much to do it to get the maximum effect, and also when to stop doing it or when not to use it altogether. And I think as someone who has often observed teachers and has the privilege of going into classrooms, sometimes you can tell when someone has adaptive expertise because it's usually when they make it look easy. It seems effortless, even when actually it's anything but. We know that under the surface there's all kinds of complexities going into that. And leading on, just to take a little bit of a sidetrack, we talked earlier, didn't we, about sessions, CPD sessions being often a mainstay of CPD. So thinking about these kind of sessions, often called inset, I would like to ask you which of these levels of expertise an inset session is most likely to develop in your experience. Okay, thanks, Simeon. That awareness. Yeah, I think we've got some consensus, and I agree. So insets are really great at addressing the awareness stage of development because they're good platforms for giving information and maybe starting to address the procedural knowledge aspect if there's a practical element built into the session. But it's worth remembering that they're not so useful on their own at addressing those other levels. And that's something to really think about, especially if inset sessions are the only form of CPD happening in your context. we'll come back to that in a bit more, explore that idea a little bit more later. So the next principle then is that CPD should be needs-based, and this really speaks to the need for training and development that responds to the daily challenges faced by teachers, and the importance as well of getting teachers' engagement in CPD, or staff, not just teachers, of course, any school staff, getting their engagement in the program, and their buy-in, essentially. So it's not just about what works in general, but what works in this context for these learners, teachers, and leaders at this point in time. A great example, of course, is the pandemic. So a few years ago, all of a sudden, schools changed from being face-to-face to online, and basically any kind of, certainly any school that I experienced, all the CPD activity suddenly shifted towards, right, how do we do online teaching? Because this is something we just do not have a lot of experience or expertise in a lot of cases. So that was an example of kind of needs-based CPD, sort of forced on schools essentially, but it was acknowledging the needs. There would have been no point in doing a CPD on your following your pre-planned CPD program once we all went into lockdown. So with this needs-based training, we're acknowledging that different staff will have different needs, and you need to know where teachers are starting from. So what's their prior knowledge, their experience, their skills, their preferences. And it's always worth stating something that my colleague Silvana always reminds me with, experience and expertise are not always the same thing. So just because someone has a lot of experience doesn't necessarily mean they're a skilled practitioner, and vice versa. So essentially a needs-based program will include flexibility and choice as well, ideally, because we're tailoring to different experience levels, knowledge levels, and preferences, just like we do with our students. So effective CPD is also supported, and support for new learning is extremely important for teacher development. Peer support is one way to do that. So peer support can promote development, and support can be both emotional or informational. So examples might be things like a coaching relationship, where there's a more expert teacher or practitioner giving support and advice to a less experienced colleague, or it could be just regular contact between groups of teachers, perhaps teachers working together in small groups according to the stage or topic subject area that they work in, and this kind of collaboration needs to be structured and supported, and based on refining and adapting new practices. It can't just be, it's not just enough to sort of meet up and have a chat. It needs to be directed in some form. Yeah, I'm sorry, looking at some of the questions in the chat, but yes, there are some. I'll try and address some of these as we go. But yeah, there are sometimes conflicts. Absolutely, it's important to note between. Well, this is the sort of the ideal model I'm talking about. So the practical principle means that teachers need opportunities to practice or try out what they have learned. And again, it's closing that gap between knowing and doing. So that gap between awareness and procedural knowledge and expertise that we just spoke about. So it's not just about adopting new ideas, but adapting existing things we do, or even abandoning prior approaches completely. So it could include any of those approaches. Impactful CPD should help teachers gain new evidence-based insights, and these insights ideally should be self-generated rather than kind of being externally prescribed. And what I mean by that is that if we are providing teachers with information about maybe a latest piece of research or a new idea or a new tool, we need to allow teachers to apply those ideas and make their own decisions on how to respond to them. So it may also mean things like supporting staff to generate their own insights through collecting data and observing practice of other teachers to see what works and to generate ideas as well. And that sort of leads us on to the next point, which is reflective practice. And as I think we probably all know from personal experience, reflective practice is fundamental to teacher learning and development because it allows us to embed and refine new practices. This might involve things like setting goals, planning actions, and self-monitoring, so that we can refine and develop what we're doing. This kind of reflective practice is often built into teacher research cycles. So some of you may have learned about or been involved in kind of formal teacher research, things like action research or supported experiments, lesson study and things like that. But it can also be as simple as, you know, taking a couple of minutes to note down what went well and what you would do differently after each lesson. So it doesn't have to be a kind of formal research approach at all. And lastly, if we want to have a effective CPD program, we need to evaluate whether or not it's effective. And the key reference point here is a guy called Gusky, some of you may be familiar with, and his book is all about evaluating professional development, and he talks about 5 different considerations when it comes to evaluating CPD. I'll briefly go through those with you. So firstly, the participant reactions. So how did they feel about the training? Participants learning. What do they report having learned afterwards? The alignment with policies, procedures, and practices of the school. And obviously that means that you need to have policies and plans and strategies for CPD, and so that you can check that the training is fitting into that. There's the evaluation of participants' use of the new knowledge or the skills. And so that might be things like lesson observations or learning walks, which someone mentioned in the chat earlier, where you might drop into classrooms and notice what is happening with a particular focus on a particular strategy, for example. And lastly, and probably most challenging or most difficult to really achieve, but I think it's really important, is the impact on student learning. And of course, that will require collection of quantitative and qualitative data. For example, things like proficiency in English progress, testing data, but also things like student feedback as well. So we can bring all those things together. And that was a very brief whistle-stop overview of a very complex topic. And I do recommend following my colleague, Silvana, and keeping an eye out for her book, which I think is coming out next year. And if you can find any of her webinars or interviews online, I recommend those. And she speaks about this in a lot more detail and depth. So this model is quite abstract, and it doesn't necessarily speak specifically to CPD about EAL, and it doesn't reference anything about content. So to look back at our quote about ensuring appropriate teacher expertise and knowledge for inclusive pedagogies, well, what does that actually involve? And this analysis I'm about to show you from Ophelia Garcia and Tatian Klein provides a nice way to think about the topics that CPD on EAL need to address. So they have 3 strands. They talk about, firstly, understanding about plurilingual students and their families. So this might just involve things like cultural awareness training for staff if they're new to the host country culture of the school or the cultures of the students in the school, or just things like ensuring staff know where to find information on the EAL students that they are teaching. The second strand is knowledge of language and multilingualism. So again, this is kind of awareness of how this is the language awareness part of it. You know, understanding a bit about how language works and also how language acquisition works and why it's important. It doesn't mean they have to be experts, but having that broad understanding. And lastly, and this is probably the one we're most familiar with, is this kind of awareness of how to deliver pedagogy for plurilingual pupils. So the kinds of classroom activities we might do. And Eowyn Crisfield, who some of you may know, who's again an expert on this kind of multilingualism topics and does a lot of teacher training herself, refers to these as the why. So these first two areas here are really helping teachers understand the why for why do we need to adapt our teaching for EAL learners, and the how. So what does it actually look like and how do we do it? So if we're covering those two areas, then I think we're going to be really onto something with our supporting our multilingual learners. Okay, the next step we might want to think about then is planning for CPD. And when it comes to planning, one way that can be useful to think about, and this again comes from my colleague Silvana, this idea is to take Guskey's 5 levels of evaluation that I just talked about and kind of flip them upside down and turn them into kind of questions that we can ask ourselves. So if you're just starting to plan a program, it might be helpful to ask yourself these questions. So we talked before about the importance of students learning and its impact. So you may want to ask yourself, what are the areas of student learning we want to improve? And obviously, if we're collecting data on our students' learning, we might realize that there are certain areas where they are struggling, or certain groups of students who are struggling. Secondly, we can think about what practices and strategies we need to achieve these outcomes. So what are the kind of things that need to be happening in our classroom? What are the skills and knowledge that are needed to help our students? In terms of school policies and practices, well, what is the organizational support needed to be in place for this to happen? This is often the part that's trickiest, because if we are, I don't know, if you are an EAL teacher or an EAL coordinator, you may not have the decision-making powers to really influence that, and that can be a challenge. But it's important to try and advocate for that in your school. With a view to participants learning, then, what knowledge and skills do the staff need to put that into practice, to learn about the practices and strategies that we've identified in the second question? And lastly, what kind of CPD strategies or interventions are going to be most efficient and effective for us in our situation, taking into account the constraints and resources and so on, and hopefully that will actually, the teachers will have a positive experience and inspire positive reactions as well, or buy-in. I keep saying teachers, but I mean this refers to any staff who are involved in working with our learners. It could also be, of course, teaching assistants or leaders or anyone who has contact with those learners. So anyway, by answering those questions, we're going to be on the right track. So now to get a bit more practical, hopefully. So in this section, we're going to look at how we might bring these kind of two threads of the Inspire model and those 3 topics to how we could use the strategies, the Bell Foundation support strategies, to actually develop EAL provision in our school. And I'm using the strategies really as a sort of illustration, but of course a lot of these techniques we'll speak about could be applied to any useful source of information related to EAL provision. And just to review, for those of you who didn't attend our webinar last week, our support strategies that came out in October, I think, or September, have 2 versions, primary and secondary. They're identical in structure, but obviously they just have different strategies according to the different stages of education included. And the document is free to download. It has a list of strategies and ideas for each band, and it includes things like relevant resources and links to research as well. The other key change from the previous version is that we've sort of aligned all the strategies to our key principles. And again, we actually released some resources last week on these principles. So there's posters you can now download from our website, and I'm sure we can share the link of that of those with you in our email we'll send out after the session. But I'm not going to repeat myself. I went through these in the last webinar, but these strategies are how the strategies in the document are categorized using each of these principles as their sort of as their heading. And the excuse me, just find my notes. Okay, so each section of the strategies is divided into band, and you'll see each band is divided into 2 sections according to whether the strategies relate to listening and speaking or reading and writing. And within each of the skill sections, there are the 5 principles listed with the resources and strategies listed beneath them. So that's how they've been organized. And I think in terms of how the strategies might inform CPD on EAL, I've shown as a picture of a Swiss Army knife here to represent the fact that I think it could be used in an enormous range of different ways. For example, here's a list of things that we might want to use the strategies to do. And I'm going to take each of those functions and we'll go through each one and look at some practical examples of applying what we've just talked about to help us improve our CPD. And you'll notice that the last 3 of those, raising awareness, embedding knowledge, and develop expertise, come from the model from Weston and Clay that I introduced earlier. Because again, we want to be focusing on more than just raising awareness, but trying to embed these new practices in our schools. So let's start with thinking about how the strategies could help us choose a focus or decide what we want to focus on in any CPD on EAL that we're able to do. We might want to consider any development work your school is doing, any planning, any strategic planning documents the school has, or this could help you inform the content of those kind of planning documents. For example, you might potentially decide to focus on a particular principle from the strategies. In term 1, for example, let's imagine that the school is about to receive a lot of new arrivals with limited English proficiency from outside the host country. So you may want to focus your CPD on aspects of social inclusion to help those new arrivals settle in and feel welcome. Perhaps in the following term, you notice that some teachers are insisting on things like English only in the classroom, and that's having a really negative impact on the band A and B learners in your school, so the lower proficiency learners. Perhaps they aren't being appropriately included in mainstream lessons. So you choose to focus on the multilingualism as an asset principle as a way of addressing that. And for term 3, perhaps you've noticed that the school's going to be introducing some new assessments next year. And you want to make sure these can be adapted and used successfully with your plurilingual learners and that they're kind of in alignment. So maybe your focus might be on assessment, for example. These are just, ideas of using those principles to kind of direct your practice around CPD. Another thing, of course, you could look at is proficiency. So maybe there's a particular group of plurilingual students in your school who aren't reaching their potential. So for example, maybe your provision is fantastic at supporting those band A and B learners who are arriving in the school, but it's lacking perhaps for those more competent learners who don't need that really targeted withdrawn support perhaps, but they're getting left behind maybe in some of the more language heavy subject lessons. Maybe your school's set up really well for those kind of more highly proficient learners, those band C to E students, but you're suddenly getting new learners who have lower proficiencies. I know that's something lots of schools are sometimes struggling with, especially as schools kind of try to increase their student numbers. You know, they often end up admitting children who have lower English language skills, despite the school being English medium instruction. And so these strategies simply provide a jumping off point for focusing your attention on supporting at a particular proficiency level. And another approach you could potentially use is to focus on a particular set of skills. So again, maybe there's a trend in your school you've noticed from looking at the data that the learners using EAL are significantly weaker in, for example, reading compared to their speaking and listening, and you want to address that. So again, the support strategies might allow you to kind of narrow down what that might involve in terms of the kind of strategies or approaches you want to take to that problem. And lastly, maybe especially if you're part of school leadership or decision making around EAL in your school, you might want to use them to help you identify how the support strategies align with the school's policies around languages. Are there any mismatches? Are there any areas that are not being mentioned or being covered? Essentially, is your school walking the talk? Are they doing what are they actually doing what they say they should be doing? So moving on from choosing a focus to raising awareness, and we spoke earlier, didn't we, that raising awareness is the first step to developing expertise. I think it's really important for addressing that question of why we need to adapt teaching for plurilingual learners. So it's really useful to help teachers understand. So we'll look at some activity types for raising awareness. And as we mentioned, inset sessions can be very useful for awareness raising. And as this picture demonstrates, teachers love nothing more than attending evidence-informed and impactful inset sessions. If only that were true. I think, as we spoke about earlier, some of you mentioned in the chat, these kind of sessions can be brilliant, but they can also be quite frustrating if they're not tailored properly for the audience. So using the support strategies, then we might want to think about how we can make sure that they are addressing the needs of our teachers and the needs of the students. So, for example, one way to do that might be looking at modeling EAL friendly tasks as a way of raising staff awareness of the kind of the support strategies document itself. So let's say you have the document, you could use that in a variety of ways with your staff. For example, typical EAL friendly tasks like matching and categorizing. So giving staff strategies in isolation and getting them to match which band, for example, they might belong with, which English proficiency band of student would you use that strategy with, or which principle, which principle would that strategy address. So, would it be social inclusion? Would it be assessment, and so on? So in that way, you're raising their awareness of these kind of issues. Things like jigsaw readings might work really well here. It's quite a long document, so maybe by splitting it up into little bits, each person or group could read a section and then bring their ideas together. Or even things like running dictations, so that you can highlight particular strategies that you want to highlight by having them dictate those to each other in a dictation game. This kind of technique is known as loop input. Okay, there's using tasks that you could use with your students, with the teachers in a training session. So if you are going to do that, make sure you build in time for explicitly highlighting those activities and explaining why they are useful, and giving teachers time to think about how they could use them in their own contexts. From personal experience, I know that if you're going to introduce these kind of activities with teachers, then they can respond quite negatively if they perceive that they're being sort of patronized or being treated like a child. Okay, so it's not necessarily clear to them why you're doing that activity. I often find this is more the case with staff at secondary level. Primary school teachers will generally do absolutely anything you give them to do and get really into it, in my experience. But for some reason at secondary level, there's sometimes a bit more resistance. So having that explanation of why you're doing that can be useful. Another good awareness raising thing we might do is thinking about flipped learning. So this idea of allowing teachers to do the reading and research at home and maybe bringing it to a face-to-face session where they can discuss or really work out their ideas. So this could be things like reading and summarizing a particular section of the document. It could be reading reading sections of the document and then comparing it with colleagues. It could be analyzing the document and identifying or choosing strategies that they found interesting or want to learn more about or would like to use, and then again with their colleagues, kind of discussing those and thinking about how they might apply them in their lessons. It could even be something like, a strategy scavenger hunt where you provide them a list of questions or things to find within the document as a way of familiarizing them with it. And again, making that just a little bit more kind of interactive and interesting. Another good awareness raising use for the strategies might be in providing models of practice. So each of the sections of the strategies, there is a table like the ones you can see on your screen, which basically explain what using some of these strategies might look like in the context of an actual lesson. So you'll see there's examples of what the teacher does, what the students or the class are doing, and what the individual learner, for example, the primary example is from a Band A learner, the secondary example is from a Band D learner, and looking at what they're actually doing. And so it's a kind of thing that staff could easily sit down and sort of analyze together in their groups and then apply that to their own subject. So maybe they could collaborate to create their own versions and their own kind of ideas of how to use those strategies for their own learners. But of course, we want to move on from just awareness raising. So in terms of embedding the knowledge, we probably want to look at different types of activity. Some of these have already been mentioned in our chat. I'm glad to hear that people are doing a lot of these things already. But these might involve things like selecting relevant strategies and supporting teachers to introduce and reflect on them. And again, it'll be really important that the strategies should be the choice of strategy should be teacher led. So that's not to say it can't be constrained in some way for you to address the issues that you need to address. For example, you might want to say, okay, we want to better support our Band A and B learners. So you're going to look at the A and B strategies in the document, and I want you to choose one of those strategies to kind of focus on and integrate into your own teaching or learn more about. In terms of increasing the depth of knowledge, we do have our great ideas pages on the website, which often go into more detail about the strategies that are mentioned in the document, because it's very much quite broad. So if you want to go into anything in more depth, you may need additional resources to do that. Student case studies, as you mentioned, can be very helpful. You might want to take a case study from a student, could be from your own school, as long as it's anonymized, I guess. Or it could be a hypothetical case of a student with a particular set of learning needs, and the teachers then use the strategies to identify what they would do in the classroom and create a kind of action plan for that learner. And obviously, if that's ideally, they could then apply that to learners in their own classes, in their own lessons, to make it practical. Micro teaching, which is the demoing of strategies or task types in a safe setting, usually using colleagues as the students. So that idea of modeling tasks, but it's the teachers themselves who might do that. That could be effective, especially with less experienced or less confident staff. And seeking examples of effective practice and sharing and recording them, recording and sharing them for the group is really helpful. And I've seen schools do this really nicely. The pandemic, again, was often a trigger for this because everything was happening online, a lot more sharing of information was taking place online. So things like using websites like Padlet, where you can post video, text, and all kinds of other links as well, can be really good for this. Everyone can share. You can share videos and have your little platform for the sharing of strategies, so that teachers can see what they look like in reality and examples of successful strategies that work at your school. Joint planning has been mentioned already, I think, and this is a really powerful tool. So just allowing teachers to work together, perhaps using the strategy document to guide them on how you might integrate EAL strategies into their planning. Again, this is particularly useful when you're doing it at that sort of start of term phase, when you're creating schemes of work and things like that as well. It can be really powerful, and especially if you involve EAL specialists as well in that, as well as the subject teachers or class teachers. And peer observations as well can be really powerful, as they allow teachers to see their colleagues do it in their context and with their students, and that's a lot more powerful than just hearing about it in the abstract. And again, the strategies can act as a guide to allow you to select key strategies you would like teachers to focus on looking out for during those peer observations, perhaps. So if we think about then developing expertise and deepening it in so that it becomes more adaptive and more moving from procedural to that deliberative adaptive stage, then we're really looking at activities in CPD that are going to help teachers experiment really and refine and improve what they do. So I won't go into detail, but I'm sure many of you will be aware of the types of classroom research that are possible, and presenting findings from these kind of research and sharing them with each other can be very powerful, along with assembling groups of relevant staff to really inform and guide school policy. So that might be things like getting a working group on a particular area, might be assessment, might be developing literacy, whatever it might be, and having these kind of groups that work together with representatives from different levels of the organization. So you have teaching staff, you might have kind of middle managers and maybe a senior leader as well, and they're kind of able to then bring in all their ideas and use that to inform and guide policy of the school. So I'm going to finish fairly soon, but before I do, one of the things we need to think about is ensuring the implementation of all the ideas that we generate from these kind of CPD activities. So I think it's really important to sort of move beyond that inset model of doing CPD. And here's a possible model that might help you. And again, this comes from my colleague Silvana, and she calls it the 6 Ds cycle. So as you can see, it's discover, decide, design, do, debrief, and disseminate. And I thought the best way to illustrate that would be to go through a quick brief case study with you to show what that might look like. So here's our case study, and our scenario is we have a relatively newly opened international school located in East Asia. So 90% of the learners are local, and the rest are predominantly users of EAL from other countries in the area. This is a secondary school. Most of the learners are bands kind of C to D, so those are generally quite a good English proficiency level within the school. There's limited in-class EAL support because most of the classes are subject specific, led by subject experts. Although there are lots of wonderful TAs, but they're not necessarily EAL specialists. The teaching cohort is filled with lots of wonderful, enthusiastic, and often quite newly qualified teachers, as well as some more experienced staff. The teachers come from different countries with a huge variety of international experience, but a lot of them are not used to having such high percentage of EAL learners in their lessons, especially those at sort of band C to D levels where they still need some language support. We have a really knowledgeable EAL coordinator, but as is often the case in these situations, he's spread very thinly across both the secondary and the primary section of his school. He hasn't got lots of time, but he has got a good relationship with the heads of year and the subject leads, and he kind of knows and can talk to a lot of people in the school. And most importantly, for the purposes of this webinar, he's armed with a copy of the Bell Foundation's classroom guidance and support strategies. So our EAL coordinator, our gallant EAL coordinator, has wants to use this 6D cycle, okay, for his school. And he's been liaising with the head of school and the heads of year, and they've decided to try out this model. So first of all, in order to discover what to focus on, they decide to put the teachers in small groups during one of the weekly inset sessions. And they put them into groups fairly randomly, and they ask each group to focus on a particular principle from the Band C section of the support strategies document. And each principle is about 2 pages of text, so we're not talking about a huge amount of stuff to read. And there's one for speaking and listening and one for reading and writing. So in this case, it's face-to-face, but this could equally be done as a sort of flipped learning home thing. And they're given a set of discussion questions. So they read the information and then they sit down and discuss with their colleagues based on these questions to try and work out which ideas and strategies they would like to learn more about or refine or try to introduce into their own teaching. Then they have to note down their ideas and choose their sort of top 3 based on agreement within the group. So that leads us to the sort of deciding phase. So again, at the end of this discussion phase, each group splits up, and the individuals from each group form a new group. So there is at least one person representing each principle, and then each individual shares a summary of what was discussed in their original group. So they're all basically sharing different ideas from the different principles. So in that way, we're kind of collecting all that information. So this is a kind of jigsaw reading activity or a snowballing of ideas. So they all work together, they form their new group, and they have to come up with their top 3 ideas based on this discussion that they think would help their students the most. So they have this discussion, and the top 3 ideas that emerge are using first language to support learning. L1 there is home language or first language. Building academic vocabulary, because some of the students often have quite limited vocabularies, and using graphic organizers comes up as something that teachers have sort of heard of, and some of them do a bit, but they're not really very sure about. They feel like it could be something they could do more of. The EAL coordinator notices that the recurring theme once they've listened to all the groups is this use of students' home languages. So the EAL coordinator, along with the head of year, decide to focus on developing the ethos of multilingualism as an asset, as their sort of priority, and helping teachers understand better how this can be implemented in their classrooms. So again, teachers are given the choice now to work in small groups with colleagues, or they can work alone. And they're going to experiment with a particular strategy taken from the support strategies document in the multilingualism as an asset section. And they're given a pro forma template to fill in with their idea, which they have to go away, think about, complete, and post to a shared space so that everyone can see each other's ideas. And this is where the design phase comes in. So several working groups emerge from this session. So we have among them a group of English teachers. They're working with year 10, 11. They're doing an inspector calls this year. And this is English literature, yeah, not English, not EAL or English language. There's a biology teacher. He's a bit of an old hand at the school and he prefers working on his own. He's currently responsible for year 7 and 8, so he's working by himself. And there's a humanities teacher who's working with the year 12 and 13 learners. And she's the only teacher working in her subject area with this age group, so she's working alone on that basis. And this is where there's some time built in. So teachers are given time to complete their plan, as we mentioned. And there's a peer feedback phase where they can view each other's plans, leave feedback, again, based on some rubrics that have been created by the head of year. And this includes a set of questions on how they will plan their evaluation of the experiment. So how are they going to measure the impact of it? And it's quite a big group of teachers. So they are put into mini pods of 3 for this sort of group feedback. So they only look at 2 or 3 other plans, and then they provide feedback on each other's plans, and that also helps them figure out what other teachers are doing and get ideas. And then the EAL coordinator and the head of year meet briefly with each group during the CPD time to provide further guidance and tighten up those plans. So by the end of this process, then we've got 3 implementation plans for each group. I'm sorry, I realize I'm running out of time here, so we'll whiz through. The English teachers are going to try to use more L1 for their discussions and pair work and drafting ideas. The biology teacher is going to experiment with translation software because he's a bit of an ed tech enthusiast, and he's going to play around with some of those, especially some of those new AI ones that are around at the moment. And the other teacher, our humanities teacher, is going to focus on using graphical organizers and the use of bringing in the use of home languages for planning as well, because they're doing a lot of really complex essay writing in her subject, and they need to be able to, she thinks that might help them structure their ideas. So the next stage is do. So teachers go away, they try out their chosen strategies and activities in the classroom. This happens across the course of a term. And in particular, they're directed to focus on how it affects the students. So they're recording that data, and they're enacting the plans that they've set up and have been carefully created. And then that leads us into the debrief phase. So then they will, in this case, for example, the literature teachers have a quick catch up every week because they're colleagues anyway, and so they might just share and refine what they're doing. The EAL coordinator visits the other 2 teachers, has a quick catch up with them just to get a sense of how things are going and listen to their experiences and their concerns. And so, he might get some feedback like this to help him understand how the whole thing's going and where we might need to help. And lastly, all the information is disseminated. So everyone has to upload their finding to a shared Padlet, where they have to describe what they did, what happened, and any takeaways or recommendations. And they include photos of student work and examples and links to resources and things like that. And in addition, they all share their findings at the next team CPD meeting. And in that meeting, they then agree on some areas that they might want to incorporate from these experiments. So, for example, they agree that the use of home languages in their lessons can be really useful for like generating ideas, but they agree it needs to be more structured and routinized because it's getting a bit chaotic. So they're going to create and use a subject-wide classroom classroom contract on using L1 that gets shared across the secondary school. One of the teachers decides to present their findings at a regional teachers conference all about EdTech. And the other teacher's got her own blog, so she might share it on that. And lastly, the EAL coordinator and the heads of year, they get together and they update some of the lesson observation criteria they've been using to ensure that they are taking into account use of L1 in the classroom. So that's something that they can then collect data on and understand if that's being used and how effectively it's being used. And the EAL coordinator also attends like a job alike meeting with other EAL specialists from schools in his school's group, and he shares what he's been doing with them as well. Okay. So I realize I've gone slightly over time, so I'm going to skip through this slide, but I think hopefully we can see in that example that each of these areas have been addressed to some degree. And I'll leave you with a final thought that there is no coursework or workshop that can substitute for direct experience with multilingual students and their families in schools. So again, it's really ensuring that CPD is rooted in practice and experimentation and noticing and recording what is happening and what works and what doesn't work in your school, in your context. And there isn't really, there's no one best practice way of doing that, but by taking into account some of the things we've talked about, I think we can really make a big difference. So there are some references, which again, I will include in the email that gets sent out to everyone afterwards with the recording. And I don't know if we have any time for questions. Sorry, Shock. Over.
Not at all. Well, thanks, Tom, for this presentation. I hope it was useful to everyone. If you have any questions, do put them in the chat. Let's see if there are any. I would perhaps say, if you think of a question after the session, feel free to email us as well, and we will get back to you. It seems I think most people have to leave now. So I will just say thank you everyone for attending the last webinar of 2023. But we will be back in the new year with further webinars. There is one scheduled and open to bookings on the 6th of February, which will cover enhancing classroom talks, or perhaps something that could be useful for your school staff. And we will also be running a number of online courses in January and February. You can find all the information on the website as usual. And if you want to hear about any news or updates, you can always sign up for our newsletter. So thank you again. Quick reminder, you will get a recording of the webinar within the next couple of days. And as Tom said, we will also include the links to the resources that he drew on. And when you leave the webinar room today, there will be a link to an evaluation questionnaire, which we would be very grateful if you could complete for us, to be able to measure impact and to inform future sessions. So thank you very much. Have a lovely Christmas break and see you in the new year.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.